Hi, and welcome everybody to another Bible study. I'd like to ask a word of wisdom from our Heavenly Father in Yeshua's name. Sorry I didn't put the warning up earlier today. It was a very busy day today, but I did put together a slide for everybody, and today's study is just basically, the Bible gives us cycles of time, and it gives us these cycles of time in a prescribed format. And what's interesting is if you just count them in order, they all seem to have the same end point, which is, my question is, what exactly is the end point? I think the tribulation itself is not a 7-year period, but probably just a couple months because of Revelation 9 and the 5 months there. So that would narrow the tribulation down to probably 2.5 months. But I'm aware that most people think it's a 7-year period, so they're all looking at the final 7-year period. So when looking at these cycles, though, that God gives us, I put together this little slideshow for you. We have 3 coinciding cycles, okay? Now, the big cycle that the Bible gives us is the Jubilee cycle, and I covered this cycle in my last video to try to document the fact that we have the 16th Jubilee and the 17th Jubilee, which are historically recorded by the Jews in Babylon. And one chat says, whoa. So, hello, that's my husband. So, okay, so we have here 3 coinciding cycles. Now, a Jubilee cycle is 49 years. That is the cycle. So if you're counting years, you can add from 1928, you can add 49 years. That'll take you to 1977. So that's how I got from 621 BC, King Josiah's Passover, all the way into our era. I just kept adding 49 years. Now, if you count all the way from the Exodus, which is what I did, and the Exodus date I covered in my old video, and I gave you all the biblical timelines that kind of like lock it in, combined with history, and it kind of locks in the Exodus to 1453, spring of 1453. The civil year would begin in 1454. So you would start counting with 1454, because they considered that year starting in 1454 because it spans 2 of our years. So if you count 70 of those from the Exodus, obviously not counting the Exodus itself because that's not a Jubilee, they're not in the land yet, but from that fixed point and getting into the land, you count 70. The very 70th Jubilee would begin in 1977. And the 71st Jubilee would begin in 2026. So that gives you the 49th year in 2025. So this is a pretty interesting. Donna says, hey, thank you. So I think I have the chat replaying. So if you make a comment, it's going to be replayed in the actual video. So I think I did that right. You have to check all these things on there. So that's the first cycle that I wanted to show you. Now, the next cycle is the Metonic cycle. Now, simply put, the moon has its cycle every 19 years. It appears on the same day of the solar year, okay? So the Metonic cycle happens every 19 years, and this is like a scientific definition. And so the 19-year cycle actually corresponds with a very interesting year that I would consider the fig tree generation, and a lot of people, most Christians, would identify 1948 as a kind of an important year. The state of Israel came to be in this year. So it's interesting that it correlates or corresponds with a lunar solar cycle of 19 years. It just so happens that this 19-year cycle starts in 1929. Well, it doesn't start in 1929, but I would say correlates. If you go every 19 years, it would go all the way back in time, as far back as you can go. So 1929, 1948, and then you count another 4 of those, and again it brings you to 2024 as the last year, and that year ending in 2025. And I'm just counting the whole year because there's 12 months in a year, and our years overlap Hebrews years. So now putting these two cycles together, we simply have a correlation here that popped up on me. My husband says, tonight is the last supermoon of the year. Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, these 19-year cycles, so this 19-year cycle would have begun around 2005. And then in the middle of this 19 years is the lunar cycle that is what they call lunar minimum. So if you add 9 years, that's about 2014, I think would be about the middle of the cycle. Now, what I noticed is that the Jubilee cycles, which I counted all the way from the Exodus, they begin in 1928 to 1929. And so does the lunar cycle, kind of falls around 1929. So we kind of see kind of like a beginning point here, and they do overlap some, because this one ends in 2024, and then that year would end in 2025, and the 49th year would begin in the fall of 2025. So they're not quite overlapping, but they're both in the year 2025. So these two both end in that same year. So now, when you're looking at the lunar cycle, and just the lunar cycle, I'm going to bring up Daniel's 2300 days again. And the reason okay, appears I'm going to have a cat fight in the background. Maybe I could throw something at them, get them to stop fighting. You kitty, stop. Anyway, okay, the 2300 years of Daniel, okay? This time period, it's spoken of in Daniel 8:26 as the vision of the evening and the morning. It is true. The vision of the evening and the morning is, well, the sun sets in the evening and the sun rises in the morning, and so does the moon. So it could be pointing, since it's saying it is true, of course this vision is true, it's a vision from God. But I think that this word true is more maybe better defined as reliable. This is a reliable vision, meaning it's cyclical. Because this 2300 years is actually perfecting the Metonic cycle. The Metonic cycle is this 19-year cycle. You can divide the 2300 years up by 19, 121 times, plus 1 year. And in that final year, it's short by 11 days. It's actually, from the whole cycle, it's 11 days over. So, all that to say that this cycle, if you start with Ptolemy II, which is the king of the south, he's the king of Egypt. Now, the king of Egypt, he started reigning over Jerusalem in 283 BC. And that's basically when he became sole king over Egypt. And so if you count from that date and go all the way over here to 2300 years, it obviously ends in 2018. I don't know if you could see that because my picture is in the way, but it ends in 2018. But it defines a 70-year period. So you could see that right here. So the last, how is that defined? Well, that's how long it takes for the moon the moon would be short 11 days each year. So that would add up to 70 lunar years that the moon would be short. So 1948, you could say, is a lunar generation, because it would complete only the lunar cycle, but not the solar. You need 70 more years to complete the solar cycle in 2018. And again, the final period here, if you add the final 2300 days in days to it, you again end in 2024. Actually, you end in 2025, not 2024. John Vance says, I'm here. Hi, John. So I'm just doing a real quick video. I'm showing these 3 different cycles. You have the Jubilee cycle, so I'll go to the next slide. So now I'm trying to show the Jubilee cycle, how it's coinciding with a lunar cycle, which is actually defined by Daniel's 2300 years. So again, always ending in 2024, 2025. Now the third one I'm going to bring up is Daniel's statue. Now Daniel's statue is the general theme of the book of Daniel. It is the general theme because it starts out in verse 1 with defining the date that the king of Babylon came against Judah. So, and that date that he became king was in 603 to 602 BC, and he was told in Daniel 2:28 that he was given the vision for the latter days. And so within this vision, we have all of Daniel's days. You'll probably hear the 2520, which is 360 days times 7. That's 2,000. That would be 7 years. And when you take it in years, instead of days, it's years of years. So this beginning point here would be 603, 602 BC. And then that would take you to, if you're only doing the 2520, that would take you to 1917. Jeff says, hi, John. John says, hi, Gulp. Are you someone I know? It's Jeff. Okay, so that is interesting. And then when you overlay the last 2 verses of the book of Daniel, so if you start at verse 1, you get this date, and the last 2 verses, Daniel 12:11 and 12:12, well, I would say it's the last 3 verses, sorry, because the very last verse says, blessed is he who waits and until the end, and then you get the vision. But these 2 dates are given in the last 3 verses of the book of Daniel. So if you simply add them, that gives you a timeline that takes you from Nebuchadnezzar's accession all the way till, I think, whatever's going to happen in 2025. And again, you have to remember when you're adding, you have to add from 602 BC, which numerically would be 601, and that takes you to 2024/2025 if you go all the way to the end of the year. So again, that's another cycle of Daniel, the statue, which is the subject of the book of Daniel. And so, sorry I gave you away, Jeff. Gulp. Gulp. Okay, so the next slide here is combining those 3 charts. So here again we have 3 coinciding cycles. We have the Jubilee cycle, the lunar cycle. Now remember, this has practically nothing to do with the Bible, except that 2300 days is a lunar cycle. So that is being defined biblically to Daniel, which they told him he was 10 times smarter than all the other men in Babylon. Well, of course, now he knows the lunar cycle. He could probably predict eclipses for 2,300 years. So that's pretty cool. And then all of these cycles have different start points. You've got the Jubilee cycle starts with the Exodus. The lunar cycle, I would say, if you want to, it starts with Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, because that's when, now the 2300 days is defined by the trotting down of the temple. So you can read in Daniel chapter 8, there's a period of time where, okay, I'm good, thanks. Rick says, hi Rick. So that's the time period where the temple is trodden down. And then at the end is when the king of fierce countenance comes in. So you have an overlaying time period. You have a 70-year time period at the end. Maybe later. I'm still doing my Bible study. I'm live right now. So, shh. Go play. So, the 70 years can also be 70 days. And the 6 years can also be 6 days. So what we're given here is 70 years plus 6 years, 76 years is the final generation. And then when you look at it in days, it's shrunk way down. It's 70 days plus 6 days, each year for a day, or each day for a year. So the 2300, just take it in the other room, please. Sorry, I have some activity in the house. I'll just talk right over it. I'm sure this is hilarious. Okay, okay, so these 3 cycles are amazing because they all end in 2024-25. And my question is, why? What are the odds that the 70th Jubilee ends in 2025? And the lunar cycles also end in 2025. And 2300 years ends in 2025. And the statue of Daniel ends in 2025. And that is 3 witnesses, but do we have a 4th? Could we have a 4th? We kind of do. So I'm going to show you what the 4th witness is. 4th witness is Cyrus, okay? Now, King Cyrus was prophesied of by Isaiah. Okay, Isaiah 44, verse 28, which is the last verse of the 44th chapter. He's prophesied to be the shepherd to Israel for God. He said, you're going to be my shepherd. Now remember, he's a pagan, foreign king. Okay? Pagan, foreign king. And God's going to use him to help Israel preserve their life and let them go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And God says in Isaiah 44:28 that this is going to happen. This is prophetic of, I believe, of the temple made without hands in our day, which is made of living stones. I think it's in 2 Corinthians 3:16, going by memory there. So that's the parallel. So we look at this history. They were in captivity for 70 years. Do you see that at the top here? There were 70 years of captivity that Jeremiah prophesied of. So Jeremiah's words ring over and over in the books of Jeremiah himself, Ezra, Daniel, and there's also a Zechariah. And they say over and over again, I understood the 70 years of Jeremiah. So the 70 years of captivity is really important. Could the 70 years of captivity also be the 70 years of the 2300 days? You see that down here at the bottom of the chart. I have marked that same 70 years that was in this chart that's right here. See the 70 years there? That's the end of the last generation. Excuse me. Yes, Trump. That's what I'm thinking. So this 70 years ends in 2018. And if you look here, excuse me, Cyrus came to rule over Jerusalem in 537 BC. Okay? Now, he didn't rule directly. He had a governor that he sent over Babylon for a couple of years. His name was Darius the Mede. But he was the ruler and he was the king over all of Babylon. Darius was just, I think, a governor over it. And it says in Daniel 11:1. It also says in the last verse of chapter 5. And it says in the first verse of Daniel chapter 9, verse 1. Okay? Now, so he rules over Babylon and the children of Israel in this date. And if you follow what happens in the next 2-3 years, counting from 536 BC to 534, that's when he takes over. And he gives the decree. So if you look down here, we have a 2300 overlay time period from the 70-year mark right here. So 70 years and then 2300 days. And so he gives the decree to rebuild the temple. So that was the significance of the end of the 70 years, was that the temple would be rebuilt. And I believe that that could be an overlay for today. Now, obviously, it's not a direct overlay because we're way over here and we have Biden for this 2-year period. And we have Darius the Mede at the beginning here. And we have a ruler over here for, is it a 2-year period is the question. Could it be a 2-year period? I don't know. But this historical overlay is amazing because guess what year it ends? It ends in 2025. And that's when Cyrus ended his rule in 528 BC. Now these dates that I have are according to Adam Rutherford, who has found them through historians and correlating, the exact BC dates. So, whenever you're doing a historical overlay, you have to look at all of the history. I have a good Bible chronologer to back you up there. So I think that's an interesting possible fourth witness to this 70 years here, or a double witness to the 70 years. And again, giving us Cyrus ruled 70, he ruled, if it depends on how you count the years, but it's basically like an 8 or 9 year rule. If you go from 537 to 528, because they ruled, from the beginning of part of 1 year to the end of part of the final year. Ultra Mega. Yeah, so Cyrus the Great was, and how he defeated Babylon is a really great story as well. And we're kind of seeing a similar defeat of Babylon today, or at least Molochism, Satanism, and all of the evil stuff that seems to be coming out, that the Kenites, because they've crept into power over the whole earth and they've gotten their way. Basically over the whole earth. I think that this is a sign that they're not going to be able to finish out the term. That I believe that God is going to provide a way for his people. I don't know exactly how. But if we look at the beginning of Ezra 1:1, you see that Cyrus, that God's Spirit moved on Cyrus to decree this freedom to the people to go and rebuild the temple. That was the Spirit of God that moved on a pagan, foreign king. Can he move upon a Christian, non-pagan, non-foreign king? I think so. I think it's possible that he could use our very own. And I think he probably will. So it remains to be seen if this is going to be yet an overlay, maybe a fourth witness to the time span of 70 and then 6 years. It seems to me like there's a lot of really good overlays here, but any which way it goes, I'm pretty sure that God is going to provide for all of us, and do so abundantly. Because he says in Revelation 12, when he talks about the woman in the wilderness, which is a picture of Israel, the seed line of Israel, Jacob. And they are, Jacob's sons are all over the earth. I believe that they are in the nations. They went over the Caucasus Mountains, into Europe, and on into America. America being the youngest, kind of like Joseph. And, he covenanted with those sons. He covenanted with, he made a covenant. And he said, I'm going to show you the book. If you don't have E. Raymond Capp's book, Abrahamic Covenant, it's a little book. It's very tiny. But this little book is very mighty and explains how God said, I swore by myself to this people that I would protect them and I would keep them. So if you read this book and you read the scriptures E. Raymond Capp gives, you need to remind God of his promises. Because it says when you remind God of his promises in Isaiah 43:26, you will be justified. Why? Because he's going to fulfill his promises. And when he does, you will be justified. It's a promise. So it makes Jacob's trouble much easier. Our trouble doesn't have to be trouble because we're given the vision just like Jacob was given the vision. And we can know and have faith and rest in that vision and be comforted in that vision. And don't be unconsolable like Jacob. And Genesis 37:35, Jacob was inconsolable. He says, I will not be consoled. I'm going to cry till I die, is what he said. And I believe God wants to console us, that everything is going to work out just perfectly. So Jeff says the solar cycle reaches its peak in 2025. There you go. So there's another proof. And, solar cycles and lunar cycles are not controllable by men or women. Those cycles are in the sky. They're set in place. And they don't change. They don't change unless God changes the solar system. But as far as I know, from the day he created it, it has been continuing on in those cycles ever since that day. Or even you could say the recreation week about 14,000 years ago. At least from that point on, the cycles have been continuing from that point on. So the solar cycle also reaches its peak in 25. The lunar cycle reaches its peak in 2025. And it's possible that it's the end of a 2,300 year cycle. And like I said, it could begin with Ptolemy II. I may have that date wrong. So let's go back and look at that. So you got Ptolemy II. Ptolemy II's king of Egypt. That's 283 BC. I could have that date wrong. Could I be 7 years off? I could be 7 years off. That would shift the whole thing 7 years to the right. So, what would that mean? That would mean that the 2,300 years ends in 2024, 2025. Again, it's going to be close to the fig tree generation because you can't move it too far because then you're going to be off the fig tree generation. So the fig tree generation, 1948, is the key to all of these cycles. If that fig tree generation is not correct and the 70th Jubilee is not correct, then yeah, we could be, I don't know how many years off, but I would think the 70th Jubilee would be significant because, again, 2025, in the fall of 2025, is the 7th year of the 70th week of the 7th set of 70 weeks from the Exodus. That's 3,430 years ago. And like I said, it's not exactly from the Exodus, it's from the crossing when they crossed over the River Jordan, and then they divided the land up 10 years later. Okay? So once they got in the land and every single tribe had their allotment, then you start counting one. You count from that date all the way to 2025, 70 Jubilees. There's not much more you can shift that date. Again, there's a lot of synchronisms in the Bible itself. From Paul, the Apostle Paul in Acts 13, and from Ezekiel. In internal synchronisms that date, and also history dates. So there's a lot of dates leading to that. I think it's an exciting year. John says none of us are getting any younger either. I'm telling you, I don't even want to add any more years. I just want to freeze. This is freeze here. Any more years, I'm going to start being gray. Somebody said you could see my grays. I don't think you can. That's why my picture's small, was to just keep it small. We don't need to look at grays. There might be one or two. I don't know. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that. Just having a little fun with it. Throw Cyrus in there. Research it yourself. Look at the Bible chronology. Cyrus did put a governor over Babylon for a period of 2 years. Now granted, it's at the beginning of his reign. And I don't think you could change the slide ruler there, because you have the 70 years of the captivity. And that's that same 70 years that's right here. Which also symbolizes captivity of Israel. A lot of people would say, well, that's the freedom of Israel because the state of Israel was born. Well, was it? It's actually on a lunar scale. It's the lunar generation. It's the lunar cycle. And those 19 years, my pastor called them locust sabbaticals. Locust sabbaticals. Not Judah sabbaticals. So that's interesting that you can line up those last little 6 years here with the King of Cyrus and the 70 years, him coming in at the end of the reign of Babylon. So this would be Babylonian captivity. And then they're still in Babylon in this time period. If you look at it, when Cyrus came in, where were the children of Israel? They were still in Babylon. Yeah, the king of Babylon was uprooted. He was kicked out. But the children of Israel were still in Babylon. And so Cyrus had to give them the decree to rebuild that temple. So the 2300 days always has to do with the trampling of the temple and the sanctuary and the city. And we've seen that in the years, the long time span, we've seen the trampling of the city. And the short time span, we see the trampling of the temple. Because there's a short time span here that this 2300 days starts on the day that they dedicated a lamb on Mount Zion, and they did a sacrifice, which is that's an abomination after the crucifixion. Christ was the one and only sacrifice. We don't need any more sacrifices. So when they did that on December 11th, 2018, I think that was also picturing a final timeline period of 2300 days, which also ends in exactly 2025. And the day that they did it, what they think was Hanukkah, lines up in the Hebrew solar calendar, and maybe I should do a video on that, how that lines up to the 9th month and the 24th day, and Haggai 2:18. Autumn Leaves says, hello brothers and sisters, blessings. Thank you. Blessings to you. So anyway, I wanted to share that with you, how these cycles, they're lining up. What are the odds that these cycles would line up in 1929, which also is, as most of you know, is the Great Depression. It's supposed to be a Jubilee year. I think it was stolen from us. I think a lot was stolen by the locust. In Joel chapter 1, it talks about 4 stages of locusts. And they come into the land and they strip the bark bare. They come into the land, okay, during a lunar time period in a locust sabbatical. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you look at Joel chapter 1, how many stages of locust are there? There's 4. So it says in Joel chapter 1, verse 6 and 7 that these locusts come in and they strip bare the fig tree, the bark off the tree so that it's white. So that's definitely a continuation of the time of the Gentiles, the trampling of the sanctuary, all the way up to the 2300 days where they're now they're doing sacrifices. So that's an additional thing in the sanctuary It's an additional trampling that when you read Daniel 8, you see that there's the final period where they have to have their time completed, the time of the trampling of the Gentiles of the sanctuary. And it's accelerated, in my opinion, because of that sacrifice that they did. And when they took that lamb, instead of killing the lamb and putting it on the fire, putting their right hand, which was blessed by God, on the head of the lamb and praying for the sins of the people, which is what it pictured the Lamb of God. They took this lamb, ripped it apart. You're not supposed to rip apart the body of Christ. They ripped it apart, ripped a leg off, and from 3 feet away, took the lamb chop and threw it on the fire. It was an abomination through and through. And I think it marks the beginning of a very important timeline, possibly the last 2,300 days. And as watchmen, we watch. We shall see. We shall see. We shall see if God is also counting that time. I think He is. I think He is. I think this 76 years is a very important time span. And I just pray to God that the reason they all fall on that date is revealed. Because the odds that the 70th Jubilee would line up with the 76th year from 1948 is just, it seems impossible that these dates would all line up. Yeah, they just tossed it on the fire, Rick. They just, from 3 feet away. It was almost like they were afraid of the fire. That is not what God said to do with the sacrificial lamb that Jesus was the representative of. So then we also have this timeline, and there's all the timelines put together. So I was just going to show you all of them put together, 3 coinciding timelines. And additionally, there might be a 4th if you consider Cyrus part of that 4th timeline. So I hope you guys all enjoyed that. I'm just going to do a short one, 35 minutes, and pray about what I should present next week. I kind of just go with it. I was thinking about presenting Cyrus next week, more biblical, showing you, Isaiah 45. Isaiah 45 talks about Cyrus, our shepherd, and that he's going to subdue all the kings of the earth, and God's going to hold his right hand. So we shall see. We shall see if there's truth to this Cyrus coming again. A lot of people say, no, Cyrus isn't going to come again. Well, the temple has to be rebuilt. There has to be a freedom for the people to worship God. It has to replay. It is prophecy. So if I got my timeline off, well, that would explain why, it just is not happening now. But so everybody says, thank you, thank you, thank you. Autumn Leaf says, well done. I love these teachings. Well, thank you. They're just praise the Father. This is all God's word. Again, put my hands for. It's backwards from. Everything is backwards. It's hard to do the Vanna White thing. Anyway, all these cycles are explicitly detailed in the scripture. You really can't get them wrong. You can't count to 49 wrong unless you have the wrong starting point. Now, a lot of other people are counting Jubilee cycles a little differently. When the Jews returned from Babylon, they started a new cycle. It wasn't based on the old one from the Exodus. It was a new cycle. And that one ends about midway between this one. Okay, so maybe I should do another video on that. And it's not bad that they're counting from that, but I think it should be at least detailed or explained as to why they're using that cycle and what that means. Because this one is the only Jubilee cycle. That when they came back into the land after Cyrus sent them back, and they finally came back and rebuilt the temple, they didn't do the Jubilees ever again. There was never ever a Jubilee recorded. So they didn't count 49 years. There was no counting of 49 years. The only time the 49 years was ever counted was from the Exodus. So that, I think, is the only way you can call it a Jubilee cycle. Now they're calling it Shemitah, or every 7-year cycle. Again, there's multiple cycles going on here, and they have multiple meanings. So when you're counting from the return, you're going to be off by about 3.5 years from the Jubilees that I'm identifying. And you also have to remember that when God gave the Sabbaths and he gave the Jubilees, he said something very specific. He said, there's not going to be any sowing and there's not going to be any reaping in a Sabbath year. So fall 2025, according to my calendar, fall of 2025 is the 49th year. It's a Sabbath year. So no reaping in fall of 2025. In spring of 2026, no harvesting, because that's their cycle. They sowed in the fall and they harvested in the spring and summer. Okay, so late 2025, no sowing. 2026, no reaping. 2027, fall of 2026 is the Jubilee that I'm identifying. No sowing. And then in 2027 of spring, no reaping. So you can't sow, you can't reap, you can't do anything from the fall of 2025 to the fall of 2027. So if all of this doesn't finish in 2025, then I would suggest, if this timing is correct, and it might not be, we have to wait until fall of 2027 to start the 71st Jubilee cycle. That would be the 71st Jubilee cycle. And I think that it ends, I think that God is going to end it on the 7th. Because he says he's going to return on the 7th trump, 7th seal, 7th vial. So that's kind of documented with the 777. So I think he would also return in the 7th year, the 70th week of the 7th set of 70 weeks from the Exodus. Again, 777. And in that year, he may return on the 77th day after Satan arrives. Nobody knows the day. We don't know that day. But John says, good night, circle pit. I don't know. I don't know what that means. Anyway, I think that he would probably choose a year that's a multiple of 7 to get the, and then at the end of the 2300 days also it says that he's going to cleanse the temple. So first there's the trampling. The characteristic of the duration of the time period is trampling, fulfillment of transgressions, fulfillment of desolations, complete desolation, complete trampling. And at the very end of the final set, 2300 days, will be cleansing the temple. So, and that could be, again, 77th day of the 7th year, of the 70th week, of the 7th set of 70 weeks from the Exodus. I try to remember to get that right. There's a lot of 7s. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope I didn't ramble too long. Good night, everybody. Have a good night.